Learn English through story. The dark desire of the heart. It was said that secrets lay buried beneath the surface of everything, beneath the polished lives of ordinary people, beneath smiles, beneath even the most honest words. For Sylvia Hall, secrets had become a second skin. At 36, she was the epitome of success, grace, and elegance. A respected professor of art history at a prestigious university, she lived a life that appeared enviable from the outside. Her students admired her, her colleagues respected her, and her peers often spoke of her brilliance in handling the nuances of culture and the delicate beauty of centuries-old paintings. But no one knew the Sylvia who lived beneath that polished exterior. No one knew the Sylvia who, in her quiet moments, was consumed by a desire she could never speak of. A desire that had grown darker and more consuming as the years went by. It had started innocently in a passing curiosity in her 20s. A fascination with the forbidden and the unknown. She had always been drawn to what lay behind the surface of things. In her studies, she had focused on art that explored the human psyche, on paintings that revealed the raw desires and fears hidden within the human soul. She had written papers on passion, on the dangerous edges of desire. But it had always been academic, theoretical, until it wasn't. As Sylvia moved into her 30s, the boundary between theory and reality began to blur. What had once been an intellectual interest in the darker aspects of human nature slowly transformed into something much more personal, much more dangerous. She found herself drawn to desires she couldn't fully understand, desires that both excited and frightened her. But rather than confronting these feelings, she buried them deeper, telling herself that it was simply a phase, something that would pass in time. But it didn't pass. Instead, it grew stronger. It was in the quiet moments of her life that Sylvia felt it the most. Those late nights in her apartment when the city outside was asleep, when the only sounds were the ticking of her clock and the faint hum of distant traffic. She would sit by her window, staring out at the world, her thoughts drifting to places she couldn't control. The darkness inside her would whisper, urging her to explore, to indulge in the secret fantasies that had begun to take shape in her mind. But Sylvia was disciplined. She had always prided herself on her self-control, on her ability to keep her emotions in check, and so, she pushed the desires away, convinced that she could outlast them, that she could keep them locked inside forever. Then she met Richard. Richard Devereux was a visiting scholar from London, a specialist in Renaissance art, and the kind of man who commanded attention the moment he entered a room. He was tall, with an air of effortless confidence, his dark hair graying slightly at the temples. His eyes were sharp, intelligent, and always seemed to be studying the world around him. When he spoke, people listened not just because of his expertise, but because there was something about him that drew people in, something magnetic. From the moment Sylvia met him at a faculty dinner, she knew he was different. There was an intensity in the way he looked at her, as if he could see past the careful facade she had built, as if he could see the darkness she kept hidden. It unnerved her, but it also intrigued her. Over the next few weeks, Richard and Sylvia found themselves spending more time together. They worked on projects, attended conferences, and had long conversations about art, philosophy, and life. But beneath their intellectual discussions, there was an undercurrent of something else, something neither of them acknowledged but both felt. It was during one of these late-night conversations, after too much wine, that the tension between them finally broke. They had been discussing a particularly provocative painting, a work from the late Renaissance that depicted a scene of forbidden love, its figures entwined in a passionate embrace, their faces filled with both ecstasy and torment. "I wonder what it would feel like," Richard mused, his voice low, "to experience something like that, to give in completely to desire, without holding anything back." Sylvia's breath caught in her throat, his words echoed the thoughts that had been haunting her for years, the dark desires she had tried so hard to suppress. She felt a rush of heat flood through her, and for a moment, she couldn't speak. "You're thinking about it, aren't you?" Richard said, his gaze fixed on her. "What it would be like." Sylvia looked away, trying to regain control of herself. "It's just a painting," she said, her voice unsteady. "It's not real." Richard leaned closer, his voice barely above a whisper. "But it could be." The air between them seemed to crackle with tension, and for a moment, Sylvia felt as though the world had narrowed to just the two of them. Her heart pounded in her chest, and the darkness inside her, the one she had kept hidden for so long, surged to the surface. Without thinking, she reached for him. Their lips met in a fierce, desperate kiss, and all of Sylvia's carefully constructed walls came crashing down. In that moment, she gave into the desire that had been building inside her for years, the desire she had tried so hard to deny. That night was the beginning of something Sylvia had never anticipated. What started as a passionate affair quickly spiraled into something far more dangerous. Richard awakened parts of her she had never known existed, and for a time, she reveled in the freedom of it. She felt alive in a way she hadn't in years, and for the first time, she allowed herself to explore the darkest corners of her own heart. But as the weeks went by, the affair began to take on a life of its own. Richard wasn't like the other men Sylvia had been with. He was intense, demanding, and unrelenting in his pursuit of her. What had once been thrilling soon became overwhelming, and Sylvia found herself losing control, and not just of the affair, but of herself. Richard pushed her to her limits, both emotionally and physically, and though part of her craved the intensity, another part of her began to feel trapped. She had thought that giving in to her desires would set her free, but instead, it had only deepened her sense of isolation. She could no longer separate herself from the darkness that had taken root inside her, and it was beginning to consume her. One evening, after a particularly heated argument with Richard, Sylvia found herself standing in front of the painting that had started it all. She stared at the figures on the canvas, their faces twisted in both pleasure and pain, and felt a wave of recognition wash over her. She was them now, trapped in a cycle of desire that she couldn't escape. The realization hit her with a force she hadn't expected. She had thought that indulging her darkest desires would bring her satisfaction, that it would make her feel more alive. But instead, it had only brought her closer to the edge of something far more dangerous. She had let the darkness into her life, and now it was threatening to destroy everything she had worked so hard to build. The next morning, Sylvia woke to find a message from Richard on her phone. He wanted to see her again, but this time, something inside her rebelled. She couldn't keep going down this path. She couldn't let him or the desires he had awakened in her consume her any longer. For the first time in weeks, Sylvia didn't respond. Instead, she spent the day alone, walking through the city, trying to clear her mind. She visited galleries, looked at paintings, and tried to remember who she had been before all of this had started. But no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't shake the feeling that something inside her had changed forever. As the days turned into weeks, Sylvia began to distance herself from Richard. She avoided his calls, his messages, and threw herself into her work in an attempt to regain control of her life. But the darkness still lingered, like a shadow that followed her wherever she went. It wasn't until several months later, when she found herself back at the same gallery, staring at the same painting, that she finally understood what had happened. She had let her desires rule her, let them take her down a path that had nearly destroyed her. And in doing so, she had lost sight of herself. But there was still time to turn back. There was still time to reclaim the parts of herself that she had lost. Sylvia stood in front of the painting for a long time that day, contemplating the figures on the canvas, their faces frozen in a moment of both ecstasy and torment. She realized that desire, when left unchecked, could become a prison. It was a force that, if allowed to take control, could destroy not only relationships but one's very sense of self. In the end, Sylvia walked away from the painting, from Richard, and from the darkness that had consumed her for so long. She wasn't the same woman she had been before, but she was wiser now. She understood that desire was not something to be feared, but it was also not something to be indulged recklessly. It needed to be balanced with reason, with self-awareness, and with respect for one's own boundaries. Over the next few months, Sylvia rebuilt her life. She focused on her career, reconnected with friends, and, most importantly, she reconnected with herself. The dark desire of her heart had nearly led her down a path of ruin, but she had found the strength to pull herself back before it was too late. Sylvia knew that the darkness would always be there, lurking in the corners of her soul, but now, she also knew that she had the power to control it. Desire was a part of being human, but it was not meant to rule one's life. It was meant to be understood, respected, and tempered by wisdom. In the end, Sylvia learned that the darkest desires of the heart could be dangerous, but they could also be a source of strength if one learned to master them, and that was the greatest lesson she had ever learned. I hope you enjoyed the story. If you enjoyed, then please like and share this video, and don't forget to subscribe our YouTube channel. Thank you for watching.